QSO Today, episode 187, Rick Karlquist N6RK. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by Soda Beams, maker of high-quality amateur radio products for the great outdoors, and QRP Labs, Hans Summers, G0UPL's kit company, featuring the QCX transceiver kit for under $50 US. QSO Today is also sponsored by you, the listener, when you become a listener sponsor or use the links on the show notes page to our commercial sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth4Z1UG, your host. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that Dustin Thomas, N8RMA, has published his annual 2018 State of the Hobby survey. He is asking interesting questions, and a large number of respondents will make the survey results more interesting to the ham radio community and to the industry that surrounds our hobby. If you'd like to participate, then click on the N8RMA survey link at the top of the show notes page in this week's episode. My QSO today is with Rick Karlquist N6RK. Rick is a longtime amateur radio operator who likes contests, DX, and over the years acquired a large square of property in California's Central Valley to have enough room to build his antenna farm. In this week's episode, we discussed building 90-foot vertical antennas with irrigation pipe and using the falling derrick method to raise tall masts and towers. Rick has acquired from his ham radio life a wide range of experience, some of which he shares in this QSO today. N6RK, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Rick?
Yes, N6RK is here. I'm really honored to be asked to be on this podcast.
Well, it's my great pleasure and honor to have you, Rick. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, some things led up to it before I got into ham radio itself. I should mention I was born in Minneapolis in 1951, and when I was around 7 years old, my dad and I built a crystal set with a coil mount and a Quaker Oats box. I'm sure you've seen those, and I simply really helped with it. Obviously, I didn't know anything about radios at the time, and my dad wasn't a ham or an engineer or anything, but he grew up in the 1920s when ordinary people built crystal sets just to be able to have a radio to listen to if they didn't have the money to get a vacuum tube radio. So that's what he knew about radio, was how to build a crystal set. When I was 9, we moved to suburban Chicago, and when I was 13, I got a Heathkit GR64 general coverage receiver kit that I built. I barely knew what I was doing. Fortunately, Heathkits are fairly idiot-proof. And shortly after that, I saw a ham radio exhibit at the Illinois State Fair where they had radio teletype, which looked really fascinating. And somehow that got me interested in ham radio all of a sudden. And but I didn't have anyone to Elmer me. I somehow found out about the ARRL. Remember, there was no internet in those days. I got some books from the ARRL and started reading about ham radio. And then in the fall of 65, I was a freshman in high school. And so it turns out that my high school shop teacher was a ham, and he held novice classes. So that was, I guess he was the closest thing I had to an Elmer. And that was instrumental in me getting licensed in December of 65 when I was 13. And my first rig was a Johnson Adventurer with 25 watts DC input. I would say I was probably lucky if I got 10 watts of RF out of it. I had 3 crystals for 80 meters and 3 crystals for 40 meters, which would also work on 15 meters. I had a high gain 14 AVQ vertical, and I made my first QSO on New Year's Eve at the end of 1965, and it was just amazing. I worked New York from Chicago, so that was a big deal for me. For Christmas, I got an ARRL handbook, and this was a real game changer. I just read this thing from cover to cover religiously, and there's a lot of stuff in it I didn't understand. I realized how little I knew. Right then and there, I said, I want to go to college and study electrical engineering, specifically radio, so I can understand what these guys are talking about. So my plan in high school was take whatever courses I need in order to get into engineering school. So unlike a lot of college students that they're not sure what they want to do, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I knew what I wanted to study and why I wanted to study it. Meanwhile, through high school, I acquired a Collins 75A1 receiver. That was a huge breakthrough compared to the general coverage Heathkit receiver. And I built a homebrew keyer in the electronics shop at school out of the 1965 ARRL handbook. It used vacuum tubes, and I used two J38 keys to make a keying paddle.
So you put them back to back. Yeah,
back to back. A lot of people built that assembly, and I worked on getting my code speed up. And in the summer of '66, as soon as school was out in June, I took the train into Chicago to the FCC office and passed my general. I was only 14 years old. I can't believe my mom let me take the train to Chicago alone, but in those days, I guess you could get away with that. Shortly after that, my high school club did a field day operation. So that was my first field day that year. And that, I think, kind of got me started in contesting. After I got my general, I bought a Johnson Ranger. So I still didn't have sideband, but at least I had a VFO. And so all through high school, I worked mainly CW. I did some AM, and I also got involved with traffic handling. So I did a lot of traffic handling on 80-meter CW in high school.
And is that through like the national traffic system?
Right, yes. So it was, I don't know if they even have any of that anymore, but you'd have your state net, your regional net, and your area net, and the traffic would work up one hierarchical layer at a time. And when I got better at it, I could actually participate all the way up at the area net. You had to be pretty good to operate in the area net. I was okay at it, but some of the other operators were just legendary. You'd listen to these guys, and they were just incredible.
Do you think that because of this mature interest that you had in amateur radio and this striving to get a federal communications license, that it made your parents look at you differently, and therefore putting you on the train to Chicago seemed to them like less of a big deal?
Oh, that's an interesting question. First of all, I don't think they were particularly enthusiastic about my ham radio hobby, but I had kind of demonstrated a lot of maturity sort of in general by that time, and so I think they thought I could handle myself.
Yeah, I'm thinking about my own teenage years. It was always unbelievable to me how much my parents would allow me to do. And I got the impression over time that perhaps it was my mature interest and the kind of people I was spending time with versus hanging out with the kids. So maybe that's kind of what spurred this question.
Well, I kind of tried to, once I got a license to drive, I would try to go around a lot of ham radio club meetings, which were mostly adults. And I don't think my parents were real cool about hanging around with adults instead of people my own age either. So it was kind of weird. I managed to do it, even though I don't know that they were really happy about it.
What radio club did you belong to in those days? And how important was it to your ham radio development?
I think it was super important. So we had the club at the school, and there was a club. We lived near Elk Grove, and there was a club. Again, I was the only kid in the club. I don't remember the name of it, but it was kind of the local Elk Grove general interest radio club. And then there were there was another club in Chicago. I don't remember the name of it, but I'd have to drive into Chicago, and it was a fairly larger general interest club. And I met a lot of people there and learned a lot of stuff. And then there's another club out in the suburban area. It met in one of the fallout shelter buildings that the civil defense people set up. I remember that building. So, yeah, I just kind of, but I think it was very important to go to club meetings, and it was invaluable, all the stuff you could learn. And not everything's written up in books. Let's put it that way.
Did you find a number of peers your age that also became hams?
Well, in the high school club, of course, it was all peers. I The other clubs were pretty much mostly grown-ups, but the high school club, we did field day. I did field day with him, I don't know, several times, and then I changed high schools, and the new high school didn't have a shop teacher that was a ham or anything like that. So then I joined the Elk Grove club, and I went on field day with them, and I was kind of really into CW, and they were more phone operators, and that trend holds true to today. I currently go out to the Palo Alto Amateur Radio Association field day. I am one of the few high-speed CW operators they have.
So you're one of the few high-speed CW operators, although there's certainly a large number of CW operators in Northern California.
Well, I just meant in this particular club, the Palo Alto Amateur Radio Association, I'm not even actually a member of the club. I just operate field day with them, and they don't really have much of an assortment of CW contest operators there. So they bring in people from the Northern California Contest Club like me.
To bolster support.
Well, to operate the CW stations.
And how many CW stations do they operate during field day?
They're in Class 4A, and they usually have 2 CW and 2 phone on at any given time.
Rick, what's your current rig?
It's a Flex 6700.
And that's a far cry from the Heathkit and the Collins receiver. What do you like about the Flex 6700?
Oh, boy. Well, I think that the biggest advantage of it to me is that it has a spectrum display combined with a waterfall display, and it has a continuously variable CW filter or sideband for that matter. And you can crank the CW filter down to 50 hertz bandwidth and it doesn't ring. This is only possible with digital filtering, of course. And that's just been huge since I got that. There's many contacts that I'm no longer losing in contests because I can't hear the other end. For example, a couple of weekends ago, we had the CQ 160 contest. I worked 36 JAs in that contest. You have to be able to hear good to work JAs.
Do you find that the having the spectrum display and the waterfall display also it kind of makes working CW or even working ham radio in the bands more visual? Oh,
absolutely. It's just it's a complete paradigm changer. Like if I'm looking for a clear frequency to CQ on, I can look at the last 10 seconds on the waterfall display and see if a frequency's been open for 10 seconds. And to the non-contest listeners out there, 10 seconds is a huge, long time in contesting to leave a frequency open. It may not seem that way, but it is. So it's good for finding CQ frequencies. And like recently, there was the Z60A pileups for the new country, and I can look at Z60A, and then I can look at everybody calling them on the spectrum display. So it's great.
It allows you to use more than just your hearing to be able to find what's happening on the band and be able to pounce on them.
It's extremely valuable. I don't think I realized how valuable it was going to be at the time I decided to buy it. It was just after buying it and using it, it was all of a sudden like, holy cow, this thing is such an improvement over an ordinary radio.
Now, are you using the Flex 6700 with the Maestro remote control head?
Yeah, I use it pretty much exclusively with the Maestro as opposed to the using the PC to control it.
And the Maestro has the ability, apparently, that you can actually take it around the house or even take it out of the house. Do you use it for a remote control operation?
That's kind of a sore point about that. They only recently announced a 2.0 level of software for the radio, which, by the way, you have to pay $200 to get. And supposedly with that software, you can at last really operate it remotely with the Maestro, but I'm still not sure they've got all the bugs of that worked out. There was kind of a fundamental flaw in the architecture that had to do with hearing your own CW side tone coming back as far as working remotely was concerned. And so I haven't actually tried to walk around the house with it and stuff. I've been too busy just doing regular ham radio operating. But I am looking forward to, someday maybe being able to do that.
So let's go back just a little bit. You said earlier that that ham radio did, in fact, play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career, and that you pursued an engineering degree. Where did you end up going to school?
Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. Go Cyclones.
You were a BSCE? Yeah,
BSCE.
Did you take a master's degree as well?
I got a master's degree at Stanford, which I studied for in my spare time while I was working for Hewlett-Packard.
Based on what I looked at online, you've actually spent your entire career at Hewlett-Packard, even as it changed names to Agilent and then later Keysight. Are you still involved, quote-unquote, Hewlett-Packard?
Yes, I retired in 2014 as a Keysight retiree, but then in 2016, I got a job working for Agilent. Now, this was not the test equipment company Agilent now, it's the scientific instruments company Agilent. So I've been working part-time for Agilent since September of 2016. I live out in Sacramento County, as you can probably see on my website. I commute in for 3 days a week, stay overnight in the Bay Area, and so I work part-time at Agilent. I'm doing RF design on mass spectrometers, which are machines that analyze chemicals.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. It's funny, I run into former Keysight retirees, and they're back to work. I find it interesting that that Keysight, Agilent, Hewlett-Packard still relies on their retirees for expertise. Do you see that as a pretty common thing?
It seems to be getting more popular now to hire back retirees or allow people to start working part-time. Well, just convert to part-time. They had a program in place in 2013 that the terms of it were you sign up for this program and you work 3 days a week for a year and then you retire. And so I signed up for that program and I worked part-time my last year, but the program, it had a deadline. You had to leave at the end of the year. So I had to retire myself. And by the way, many other people all had to retire in March of 2014 when the program ended for us. And since then, they've kind of liberalized that program. And the conditions I'm back at Agilent under is I'm not in any particular program. I'm simply hired as an external temporary worker, as they refer to us. I work through a temporary agency, so I'm not an official Agilent employee. I'm a contractor. Doesn't really matter. It's the same job either way.
Does experience make a big difference?
It makes a huge difference. I have going on 40 years experience, and I just have a vast knowledge base. And when I looked at all these mass spectrometer schematics, and I'd never seen a mass spectrometer in my life, and I'm looking at these circuits and say, oh, this circuit, yeah, I've seen that before. This other, I've seen that before in some other application. So it was like everything in there almost, I'd seen it somewhere else for some other purpose. And I'm just kind of like put all these pieces together and you get a mass spectrometer.
Well, I was going to ask this question later, but I should ask it now. On your professional website, you list 20 patents to your credit. Do you have one that you're especially proud of, and why?
I'd say the bridge oscillator from 1997. That's probably the most important breakthrough I ever had. That was a fundamental advancement in oscillator circuit design, which had kind of stagnated for decades.
Are there any Agilent Keysight products where that bridge oscillator is now used?
It isn't used now. There's been a lot of changes in Agilent and Keysight over the years. So they build about 30,000 model E1938A oscillators that use that circuit, and you still see those all the time in surplus. A lot of people buy them for hobby purposes.
Oh, so my HP 8920A might actually have a Model E 1938 oscillator in it.
No, they were not used in instruments. They were used in what was called smart clocks, which were master clocks for cell phone base stations, they were locked to GPS, and but they had to be able to do what was called holdover, meaning the frequency would be fairly stable in case they lost the GPS signal for a length of time. The other thing I would mention about it, patents, if you go back to 1992, I got a patent for the architecture of the HP cesium atomic clock. So I guess that would be a close second to the oscillator patent as far as which ones I'm proud of. And that clock, it started out being made by HP, then it went to Agilent, and then it went to Symmetricom, and then Symmetricom sold it to Microsemi. And so that clock now, 25 years later, is still in production. It still is the world's most accurate commercial atomic clock, and it's the all the master clocks in the GPS ground stations are 5071As.
And now this message about Whisper Light from SodaBeams. One of the most interesting innovations from SodaBeams is the Whisper Light antenna tester. It is a very clever 200 milliwatt WhisperNet transmitter that can be connected to any of your antennas to see how they perform around the world using the WhisperNet network. The longer the Whisper Light is connected, the more stations will show up on the Whisper website. The Whisper Light comes in two flavors, the Flexi and the Classic. The Flexi requires external low-pass filters, also available from SodaBeams, whereas the Classic has built-in filters for both 20 and 30 meters. These clever devices are USB programmable from your computer or smartphone. And while the Whisper Light is the ideal real-world antenna tester for any ham radio station of any size, it is also quite portable for antenna testing from your Soda mountaintop or a national park. With its accessories, it can be powered for days from a USB power pack. I created a Whisper Light wish list of the Flexi and accessories available using my special link on the show notes page. This will add to your shopping cart all the pieces needed to make getting the Whisper Light simple and easy. Of course, Richard, G3CWI, the proprietor of SodaBeams, has instructional videos available online to find out more about Whisper Light and all of the amazing SodaBeams products. Be sure to click on the SodaBeams link on the show notes page of this episode. SodaBeams, amateur radio for the great outdoors. And now back to our QSO Today. Now, you mentioned earlier that you're a contester, and you're the former president of the Northern California Contest Club. How did contesting start for you?
Well, it was field day in 1966. I think that was what got started, and after that, I got on from home for the sweepstakes contest. I did that several years while I was in high school.
So is there a progression or an evolution to a contester's life? I mean, you start small and work your way up?
Well, that's kind of a difficult question. In my case, I kind of went through a period of time. I kept trying to build bigger stations so I could be more competitive in contests. And by the 1980s, when I'd moved to California, I had a tower with a tri-bander on top, and I was actually able to get a clean sweep in sweepstakes back then in the 1980s. That was the first time I ever did that. And I think the thing with contesting is it's like when you first get on, you see these other scores of these guys, and it's like, oh, he worked how many QSOs? It's like, I could never do that. And somehow you get on, you start contesting, you build up your station, you talk to the other contesters, you keep getting on, you get better and better every year. And then before you know it, it's like, wow, I'm making 1,000 QSOs in sweepstakes. And I never thought I could do that.
So during these contests, will you actually work, 10, 12 hours at a time, or even maybe the full day, the whole 24 hours? Like in sweepstakes, you're supposed to work 24 out of 30 hours. I've never been able to do that. If I can get up to 20 to 22 hours out of the 30-hour period, I'm doing well. My big limitation in contests is just I haven't got the endurance to put in the kind of time that the real champions put in. And then in the DX contests, a lot of those are 48 hours, and some people might work 45 out of 48 hours. I just don't have the endurance to do that. Now, I saw an aerial picture on your website of your QTH in 1997. where you were before the antennas were installed, and you're kind of showing what the parcel looks like. It looks like you chose to live on a flat land out in the middle of the country in order to build a contest station. Is that what you did?
Contests and DX, yes, and especially getting on 160 meters. I think that was the real impetus. I tried to do 160 meters from a city lot in the Bay Area in California, and I just, it was like I could barely work the East Coast if I was lucky. I don't know that I ever worked even the Caribbean, let alone something like JA. I could never work JA on 80 meters, even running a kilowatt. But in the mid 1990s, there was a reflector on the internet called top band reflector. I started reading that. I got really interested in 160 meters, and I kept thinking, well, if I can just get a decent piece of land, I can do something serious on 160. And I got fairly well off financially during the late 90s when the stock market went way up. And I thought, I don't want to be one of those guys who waits till they're at retirement age and then they go out and buy some ham radio QTH. I'm doing it now when I'm 45 years old. And so that was a really great decision, I would say.
So you have a big parcel. What could you do with a parcel like that, on 160 meters? What would you build out there?
Well, when I first got the parcel, the first thing I did was put up a 1,300-foot long beverage antenna. So I thought, wow, this is just really going to be impressive. And, well, it turns out there was so little I knew about what I was doing in those days. Because of the high conductivity ground, only about 400 feet of the beverage actually does anything. The rest of it is just wire that you've wasted. I didn't know that. There were so many things I didn't know. So the beverage did work, but it worked like a 400-foot beverage, not a 1,300-foot beverage.
Well, it seems to me also with property that size, you could put up a 160-meter loop antenna. Did you use the ground to experiment with different antennas?
Well, first of all, I don't subscribe to the 160-meter loop idea. I don't think that's a good antenna, so I never put one up. I did put up, I've got a 90-foot vertical. That's my main transmit antenna. I did put up a lot of 400-foot beverages, so I could select 6 different directions with 400-foot beverages. I had that up for a while. I keep thinking someday I'm going to put up a receiving circle of antennas in a 320-foot diameter circle. I have enough space for that, so I don't know. Maybe this fall I'll work on that.
Now, do you let people plant lettuce or something like that in your ham radio field there?
People from time to time would want to know if they could plant hay on it or something, but when I put up the 160-meter vertical, I put out about 20 miles of radial wires on the ground, and so there was no way anyone was going to farm around that. And no, I didn't want anybody coming on there and farming it. I sprayed it with a lot of Roundup to keep the weeds under control. So I kind of killed off all the native grass. It's been sprayed so many times, and there's different weeds now. I have to mow it a few times a year to keep it under control. But as far as running it out to farming, no, I never did that.
Now, you wrote an article for the National Contest Journal about receiving loop antennas. What are receiving loop antennas, and what do you like about them?
Receiving loop antennas should be distinguished from transmitting loop antennas. Those are kind of two completely different discussions. Transmitting loop antennas, I think, are a poor idea. But with receiving antennas, receiving loops only have a efficiency of 0.1 to 1% typically, but that's fine because the noise level is so high on 160 meters that that amount of efficiency will still overcome the noise in your receiver. And a loop antenna allows you to have a null in 2 different directions that are 180 degrees apart. And what I found is that in many QTHs, there's sort of a dominant power line noise that comes from a particular direction that you can null out with your loop by turning it. So I guess that's its main claim to fame. And the other thing is that my receive loop design is fairly small, so you can locate it almost anywhere you want, as opposed to like if you put up a full-size 160-meter dipole, that's huge. That's not something you can just locate wherever you want. So it's like I've experimented around with putting loops at the back of my property, which is a quarter mile from the front of the property, and the power lines are at the front of the property. So the idea is get away from the power line interference. And I should say that my article on the receiving loop is it's just a shielded coaxial loop, which has been in lots of radio handbooks for decades. That's not new. My only contribution was the feed network for it. So you'll see the antenna, the title is actually an improved feed network for a loop antenna. So what I found was I wanted to try a shielded loop, and I didn't like any of the feed networks that I saw. So I went out and invented my own.
And what was unique about your feed network?
It provides a fairly decent 50 ohm match from below 160 meters up to above 60 meters. And it's remotely tunable with varactor diodes. And it's a lot more efficient than these broadband loops that you can purchase that come with expensive preamps. This loop being tuned, it puts out a lot of signal, and you don't need a preamp. You can plug it directly into your receiver.
Would you recommend a receiving loop for someone that wants to work 160, 80, 40 for a residential lot and maybe use a vertical antenna for transmit?
Yes, I think you should. It's a tool in your toolbox. I don't want to oversell it. Depending on what your particular interference situation is, you might be able to handily null out power line noise and give yourself an advantage of a number of dB. I know when I was in the Bay Area, I tried it out there with just the residential power line noise, and it was pretty good. The power line noise it came from a particular direction, and you could null it out.
Do you have a portable station that you carry with you when you go into the Bay Area?
Well, for a long time, I had a house in the Bay Area, and I had this property out here. And in the Bay Area, I had a 60-foot tower and a 55-foot tower and a Yagi on top. And I had a station there. And then I had another station out here in Sacramento County. And I would typically drive up for the weekend for operating contests.
I saw another article. This also explains some antennas that you have on your property. You have what's called a 7-hex antenna array. What is a 7-hex antenna array, and how are you using it?
Well, I don't actually have an array up. I designed it and I built it. I built a 40-meter kind of demonstration version of it, but I never went beyond that. And I eventually got a 40-meter Yagi, so I kind of lost interest in it for 40 meters. But anyway, to explain what it is that you have 6 antennas in a circle or a hexagon, if you want to think of it that way, and then you have a 7th one in the center, and it allows you to switch to 12 different directions without physically moving anything. You can electronically switch it to 12 different possible directions, and it has 8 or 9 dB of forward gain. And it's a transmit antenna. It's not just a receive antenna. So my grand plan had been to build it for 160 meters. I actually went so far as to build I was going to use my existing 90-foot antenna as the center and then put the other 6 around it. I actually built the 6 verticals out of irrigation pipe, but I never actually put them up. And it became clear from operating on 160 that because I have high ground conductivity here, I get out extremely well, and I'm pretty much limited by receiving. And so it's much easier to make a receiving array than a transmitting array. And I kind of decided that would be my plan to make a receiving array. And I never actually did that either. I'm still kind of thinking about it.
Just out of curiosity, I'm imagining this 7-hex antenna array. Is the one of the antennas in a particular direction, or one of the verticals in a particular direction, is working against that center vertical? And are they phased, or is one an active element and one's a reflector?
No, it's all driven. It's not parasitic, and you drive all 7 elements all the time. It's just a matter of what phase and amplitude they have.
Oh, very interesting.
And I should say there's any number of other circular transmit arrays that have differing numbers of elements. Like there's a K9DX had one that had 8 elements in a circle and one in the middle. That was called the 9 circle. It was, I believe, designed by W0UN. And for various reasons, I didn't like the drive networks that were used with those antennas. And the advantage of the 7 hex is it has a very simple drive network as compared to the other designs.
Now, I noticed from your website, and you just mentioned it, that you're using irrigation tubing for vertical antennas. Is that a common material out where you are? And how stable is that? As you say you have a 90-foot antenna, a vertical antenna. Are you using an irrigation tubing for that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So as far as the availability of irrigation tubing, that's highly variable on where you are. And if you're in an agricultural area where people irrigate, it's a lot more available than it might be in some other places. But when I got here in 1997, there was another fellow nearby that had put up a 80-meter foursquare using irrigation pipe. And I asked him where he got it. He got it from Golden State Irrigation. I called them up and it says, "Oh, yeah, we used to sell that, but not anymore." But then an outfit called Rain for Rent came up, and they put up stores all over California that sold it for a while. And now if you call them, they say, "Yeah, we used to sell that, and we only special order it, and you have to get it in Fresno." Well, meanwhile, I just around here was just driving down the road here about a half a mile, and I saw a bunch of this pipe laying on the ground. It says "for sale." So I bought it from my neighbor, and then a little while after that, I saw, and I was on another road, and a guy had 3,000 feet of the stuff for sale, including a trailer to move it. So I ended up buying that from my neighbor, and all this stuff you could buy on the used market was all 2 and 3 inch, and then I went up to Rain for Rent and bought the 4-inch stuff. I had to buy that new. So I kind of lucked into my irrigation tubing. I pretty much have a lifetime supply of it.
And so what you're doing is you have it, you're using 4-inch with 3-inch in it. I mean, how long is a piece of irrigation tubing, and how are you making it longer? How do you get 90 feet up in the air?
First of all, the standard length is pretty much 30 feet around here, at least. I do have one section of 40-foot long 3-inch tubing, but all the rest are 30 feet long. And the first time I put up a 90-foot vertical, I made it all out of 4-inch, not knowing any better. I figured I better over-design it. And I did a lot of experimenting. I should say, when I started doing irrigation tubing antennas, there were a few of them around, but there was very little information on them, and there was like no information on how to connect the sections together. I had to kind of make all that up as I went along. But what I kind of converged on after doing a lot of experimenting was a design where I have 30 feet of 4-inch at the bottom, and then 30 feet of 3-inch in the middle, and 30 feet of 2-inch at the top. And then on my website, you can see there's reducing couplers I've designed out of PVC water pipe that allow me to connect the sections together. And
what are these pipes made of? Are they aluminum?
They're made of aluminum. They're not made out of anything you would have heard of, like 6061. They're I don't remember the alloy right off the top of my head. I think it starts with a 3. But so it's an alloy that it takes a set more easily than 6061 does. But it gets the job done.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. And now back to our QSO Today. What is the falling derrick method of tower raising? It was mentioned in context of the WRTC in one of the previous episodes of the QSO Today podcast. Can you explain what that method is? Because you have a very nice explanation with pictures on your website.
Well, when I first attempted to get involved with irrigation tubing, I put three 4-inch sections together to make a 90-foot vertical laying on the ground, and then I went to the center of this thing and I lifted it up. The stuff's very lightweight. A 4-inch one, 30 feet long, only weighs 22 pounds. So this whole thing was 66 pounds. So I kind of got under it like a barbell and lifted it up and got it over my head. And with the center all the way over my head, the ends hadn't even begun to think about leaving the ground. Most of it was still laying on the ground. It's pretty stiff stuff, but it's flexible enough that it just kind of lay down on the ground. And so I eventually realized that you could only pick it up if you, like, imagine you had two people on it at the 1/3 of the way in from each end. They could pick it up and it would kind of stay in one piece. So now the question is, how do I raise this up with ropes? Well, if I just had a conventional gin pole, I'd have to have one rope that went out to the point 30 feet above the ground and another one that went out to the point 60 feet above the ground. These would be two separate ropes on their own pulleys. And now you have to simultaneously pull on these two ropes to raise this this antenna. And you have to be very careful that you don't get ahead of yourself on one rope or the other, because it'll start bending a lot. And so then I saw an article in the RSGB handbook about a field day operation where they used a ladder as a falling derrick and pulled up some field day antenna. And I realized, well, that was the secret. I tie ropes without pulleys to the top of the falling derrick, and then they simultaneously lift up the antenna while I pull the falling derrick down. It's pretty much essential if you're pulling up something that's kind of a wet noodle-ish sort of a thing to have a falling derrick so you can pull up on it in multiple places at the same time. Now,
is there a ratio between the height of the derrick, which is essentially like another tower or a post or something like that? Is there a ratio between the height of the derrick and the pole that you're trying to pull up?
Well, my initial design, I used 45 feet of 4-inch as the falling derrick. So it was a 30-foot piece and a 15-foot piece connected together. Again, I over-designed because I wasn't sure what I was doing. But I eventually converged on a design where I used just 30 feet of 4-inch as the falling derrick, and that's sufficient. So the trade-off is that the falling derrick, it has to be really stiff or it'll just buckle. And the stiffness of the irrigation tubing is proportional to the cube of the diameter. So like 4-inch is much stiffer than 3-inch, which is way stiffer than 2-inch. But then the other problem with the falling derrick is if the falling derrick is too big or heavy or long, you won't be able to just walk it up. So then you'll have to have another smaller falling derrick just to put the main falling derrick up. I've actually seen people resort to that. But fortunately, the 45-foot one was just doable to walk up, whereas the 30-foot falling derrick is pretty easy to walk up.
You take the top end and you just walk it straight up, and it somehow the top of it has a rope that's now tied to, say, the 60-foot portion of the noodle that you're trying to take up.
And then it has another rope tied to the 30-foot point.
Oh, like a triangle.
Yeah, and then besides those ropes, there's a rope going back for you to pull on it, to pull it down to the ground. And there's also ropes going off to the side so it doesn't fall over sideways.
So this is a project that you don't do by yourself. You actually call out the troops to give you some help to man the ropes?
No, my philosophy was I want to do everything myself. I don't like that cast of thousands ideas. So this antenna on my website, I put it entirely up single-handedly.
I saw that you actually also do that with, Roan Tower section or any kind of mast that you need to take up.
Right. So I had a 50-foot Glen Martin tower, And there's should be pictures on my website showing I pulled that up using my minivan.
I see. So what you're doing is you're using the minivan to pull up the derrick, and that at the same time starts to pull up the tower. Oh, you're pulling the derrick down.
Yeah.
While raising the tower, so the derrick is already vertical, and the tower is laying on the ground. Oh yeah, that's very cool.
So the first time I tried that, I made this is all learned by mistakes. I hope you got the drift.
I'm thinking about some of those mistakes, especially with the minivan.
So even though I seem like I know what I'm doing now, I made a lot of mistakes to get where I am. But the first time I put together this gin pole made out of 2x6s or some lumber, I don't remember what it was, and I thought, oh, this is great. So here's the thing: you take the minivan, you get the rope cinched up until you kind of feel like it's tight, and then you move forward about just 1 or 2 feet, then stop, put the parking brake on, and walk back. And good thing I did that, because this gin pole was just totally bent, buckled. It would have just snapped if I'd moved very far with it. So, okay, well, now I know I need a much stiffer gin pole or it'll buckle. And so I had to get more lumber and make the gin pole a lot stiffer. And then I was able to raise it.
Do you operate your station by remote control now?
I don't operate by remote control now. I should say, you haven't asked me much about my DX career, sort of, but I kind of, when I got my step IR antenna up in the early 2000s, I kind of got interested in DXing again. And I think the Peter 1 expedition just completely addicted me to DXing. So I got into this habit of I might drive up. I worked during the week in the Bay Area in California, in Santa Clara at Agilent, and if I would try to work these expeditions on weekends, but I would, if necessary, drive up in the middle of the week. And so I can remember various kind of famous expeditions I made where, not expeditions, just trips up. It's 100 miles up here, and I get up at 4 a.m, drive up, get some sunrise opening on 80 meters to some expedition, and then drive back to the Bay Area and go to work. So I thought, well, I need to have a remote station here for de-expeditions so I can work them while they're on the air. So I got interested in remote controlling then, and it was in its infancy in those days. So I did get a successful remote base going, and I can remember from working various de-expeditions during the week. I didn't have to drive all the way up to Sacramento County anymore. So that was useful as far as it went. But like for contesting, it was never good enough to do contest remotely. That's still kind of problematical. And the other thing I ran into was that it's one thing to say, well, now I can operate the station anytime I want, even if I'm in the Bay Area. But what I found was I didn't have a lot of spare time to be operating the station during the week when I'm working. So I mainly just use the remote for important de-expeditions.
Now, I was looking at a reflector where you were talking in 2000 about remotely controlling. And at that time, I don't know, as I recall in 2000, I was still on dial-up. So there wasn't a lot of opportunity perhaps to use the internet for remote control. Did you end up using the internet for remote control, or did you use like UHF or 440 or something like that to get to your station?
No, it was internet for the control lines, and it was the telephone line for the audio. You're probably not familiar. I don't know if you're familiar with the geography out here, but UHF isn't going to go from the Bay Area to Sacramento County, as far as without going through a repeater anyway. So that wasn't an option. And I had dial-up internet here, and then eventually I was able to get some a higher speed internet, but the audio was always terrible. I used a audio service called IP Sound, and that was better than Skype, but there was still a lot of packet dropouts and stuff. So what I did was I got an auto patch that they sell for radio stations, broadcast stations are putting on talk shows. And I use that for the audio, and the audio is very low latency over the phone line, at least here. So that worked quite well, and the latency in the control signals was acceptable. I didn't try to send CW remotely from a paddle. That's still hard to do even now. I had canned messages, and so if I'm working a de-expedition, I had my call, and I had 599, and that was all I needed.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life? We
purchased this property up in Sacramento County, and the first thing I did was move my stepdaughter into one of the houses here. A little piece of advice to anybody buying property: you want to get property with houses and have people in the houses. You don't want to just have a bare piece of land that you're not around to kind of watch. So it was very useful to have my stepdaughter here to watch the property, and then she didn't have to pay rent. And later on, various other family members that needed a place to stay would stay here. There were 3 houses on this property when I bought it, so I got really lucky with that purchase. And then we would just go up here on weekends and get away from the Bay Area. The family hated being in Cupertino in the Bay Area, and it was really nice to get up here and have some wide open spaces. And it's different having your own land as compared to like going to a park. So we really got a lot of use out of the property with all the family members. So I think and then now we've sold the property in the Bay Area and we live here full time. We build a new house on it to live in. We've still got the old houses for if some relatives want to stay here. So it's been very useful to the family, I would say.
So you created the family compound.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
that's pretty cool. What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now?
I guess just, I don't know if there's anything now that's different from years past that's particularly exciting, except maybe like the flex radio is quite an improvement in technology. So I guess the technology continues to improve.
That was the first thing that came to mind when I asked you the question the flex radio is really kind of outstanding in terms of changing the ham radio user experience.
I mean, when I think back to when I had an adventurer and a general cartridge receiver, I mean, this is so many light years ahead of that. I mean, it's just unbelievable it's unbelievable I ever made any QSOs with what I started out with.
Do you ever think you might miss some of those days or those radios?
Oh, no, I don't miss those radios at all. The ones now are much better.
You don't wax nostalgic for the old radios?
No, I don't.
Okay. What advice would you give to new or returning hams?
I guess learn as much as you can about electronics. Now that you have the internet, there's all kinds of material to read on the internet. Learn. Learn how to use EasyNet. I see people all the time that, I build a big antenna farm with $100,000 worth of towers, but can somebody run EasyNet for me to analyze my antennas? And it's like, you put $100,000 up in the air and you didn't model on an EasyNet? So it's like, you got to learn all the tools, and it's all about education.
Well, I think that's terrific advice. And with that, I want to thank you so much, Rick, for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It's been fun. I always like to learn something new, and I learned a lot of new stuff today. So with that, I want to wish you 73.
73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Rick. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in N6RK in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the bottom of the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. I want to thank again both SodaBeams and QRP Labs for their support of QSO Today. Be sure to show your support by clicking on the links on the show notes page to get to these fine sponsors. Finally, tell your friends about QSO Today. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio and in the iTunes Store, and of course on a host of podcast services and applications. Stitcher is still my favorite. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.